Welcome to Open Comments with myself, Ash,
and me, Oliver,
where we'll discuss things openly with our guests from a variety of backgrounds and from different walks of life. Through this podcast, we hope to give you an inside look into a variety of topics with an equal mix of humour and candour. In this series, we'll touch on some of the following topics: healthcare, HR, diversity, access to technology, and lots more. We hope you enjoy our show and look forward to bringing more topics into the fold. Let's get started.
Okay, welcome to Open Comments, and as Ash mentioned earlier, today we'll be touching on some topics involving standardization of data collection and the influence of lifelong learning. And to help us cover those topics today, we have Neil Parkin, Ph.D. And Neil is a scientific consultant with extensive experience in viral drug resistance and laboratory diagnostics, especially for the HIV-1 and hepatitis C virus. In November 2009, Neil founded Data First Consulting, based in Sebastopol, California. Data First Consulting provides scientific consulting services to clients in industry and public health organizations, including technical writing, sequence analysis, drug resistance data analysis and interpretation, laboratory quality assurance guidance, project management, meeting organization, and strategic advice. So, Neil, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So to start us off, I was wondering, you have a very extensive bio. Could you maybe explain your career journey so far for us?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Started in the sort of hardcore academic stream after high school, and got into biochemistry initially in my undergraduate work at McGill University, having been led down the life sciences pathway from an influential organic chemistry class taken earlier. I'll never forget the moment where I sort of realized that all life was this combination of organic molecules coming together somehow to create a living thing. That was my launch point, I guess, and then did my undergraduate studies in a fantastic institution at McGill University. Then that led me into graduate studies and started doing a little bit of work on a virus-related topic at that point, more as a model system than anything else for the type of work that I was doing at the time. Then I got my Ph.D. there at McGill, and then came to California to do a postdoctoral research stage with a fantastic scientist named Harold Varmus, who had just won the Nobel Prize before I arrived in his lab, and worked on a few different things there, a little bit more on HIV. That was a natural kind of transition for me coming out of my PhD, but also a little bit of oncology research there. Then after that, had to make a kind of a important career decision between continuing in the academic stream, which at that time the funding environment for new investigators was getting quite difficult and competitive. And the nature of the project that I'd been working on at that time was such that the next steps were somewhat risky. So I considered an alternate career path at that point, which was in the biotech industry. And so here in California, of course, it's a hotbed for that type of work. And so there were lots of opportunities, and started working in a small company that was focused on developing influenza virus vaccines. That was a fascinating period of time, as I think during that phase became what I guess I could call a card-carrying virologist, really getting into it kind of hardcore, and also a little bit of a step closer to practical applications of what I was doing. So before, it was really very much basic research. Here there was a very clear product in mind in terms of a vaccine to help improve, people's health. So That was like 3 years. So I'm talking 93 to 96. Then I moved to a company that was just starting. So I was the 12th employee at this small company called Virologic at the time, which was focused on developing diagnostic tests. So as opposed to a biological product like a vaccine or a drug, we were developing laboratory tests that would measure the susceptibility of HIV to antiretroviral drugs. So as the field of anti-HIV drugs was exploding, people were really starting to understand that the virus could develop resistance to those drugs under certain circumstances. And if you understood those patterns of resistance, you could design usually a new combination of drugs that would work best for that patient's virus. So that was, I was there for 10, almost 11 years, I guess, and saw a product go from its inception to reality, scale up through, and here's where a little bit of the kind of standardization thing comes in, I would say, from starting from a research bench to a full-fledged operation that's being done to produce results that are important for patient management. And so the level of attention to detail in order to do things reproducibly day after day, week after week, year after year was certainly a big learning experience for me. And not one that came naturally, but clearly is necessary to do. So then after those 11 years, I wanted to try something a little different. And there's kind of a progression, if I think about it, from over the different stages that I've been through, where trying to maximize the impact of what I wanted to do and what I have some talent to do. And so working in HIV, it became clear after a while that in terms of a global picture, the biggest area of need was in developing countries, in Africa especially. And so I decided to try the public health route and moved to the World Health Organization. This was in 2008, and worked on the HIV Drug Resistance surveillance team there. That was an interesting phase because different focus. Instead of an individual patient at the end of the day, you're doing things at a population level, more of a public health approach, trying to provide information to ministries of health all over the world about what kind of drug regimens they should be offering to the patients who needed it. And so again, a different mentality, a different way of thinking about things, and so another big learning experience there. Then I after a year and a half or so there, I decided I wasn't really going to be a long-term proposition in the public health arena organizationally, and so I moved back to California and started my consulting company. And ever since then, I still support the WHO as a consultant on the same type of work. I help manage a big lab network that does the testing and support of drug resistance surveillance, but also do a lot of technical writing for various companies and organizations who need help getting their data into the public realm in terms of scientific journals. So, and that's just a talent that I kind of learned over the years of my career, and so I can provide that as a service to others who may not have the bandwidth to do it, internally. And that's been fun because the topics are quite varied. So I generally stick to the viral diagnostics arena, but it's been multiple different viruses over time. So it's not just HIV, it's not just Hep C, it's Hep B, it's hepatitis D, hepatitis E, all kinds of other things that I knew existed, but never really paid much attention to. So I get to learn about those in the process. So I like that.
Nice. And staying on the topic of healthcare, what do you think are the biggest problems in healthcare today, both worldwide and in the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm certainly no expert on the big picture healthcare issues, for example, in North America and in the United States in particular, there are big economic forces at play that I'm really no expert in. One of the things that drove me from the industry that I was working in to the public health arena at WHO was a kind of inherent conflict between for-profit industry and optimal healthcare. So thinking about things at the individual level, there are times when there may be some information or a strategic direction or things like that are what you think are the best thing for the patient at the end of the day, but may not be the best thing from a business point of view of the company, right? So there's sometimes this inherent conflict that happens, and things work well as long as the mission of the company and the product and how it's used and so on for healthcare are aligned. But there are times when that doesn't converge well, and that's what kind of drove me out of that. So I think that's something that happens in the sort of for-profit healthcare world. And another big problem that I've sort of seen from afar that I think came very much to the forefront during the pandemic is the public health, the conflict between the public health strategy and actions and things that health agencies and governments would like to try to do in order to protect and take care of as many people as they can, against the sort of individual freedom type of mentality, right? So you could pick so many examples, I think, during the pandemic, vaccination or mask wearing or whatever it is, that I think the science pretty clearly supports the best way to implement those things and to protect as many people is for everybody to do something. But that conflicts with people's sense of I can do whatever I want. And so I think that's kind of a core problem that is going to come up again and has come up in many different settings. So that's another one that I would call out in terms of healthcare problems. And then the last one, I think, is this phenomenon of whatever you want to call it, disinformation or misinformation amplified, which is nothing new, right? It's happened for centuries, but it's been so amplified through social media and selection bias and all sorts of things that socially are very interesting, but I think lead to bad healthcare at the end of the day. So, yeah.
And following on from this, how are standards used in the work of drug resistance and vaccine development?
Well, I think from my perspective and experience in the drug resistance world, there are a couple of ways to think about standardization and the importance of doing things in a consistent way. One is the method for generating the data in the first place. So for HIV drug resistance testing, a blood sample needs to be taken from a person who's HIV infected. That sample has to get to a laboratory where it's processed and the genetic material of the virus is sequenced, and that information is interpreted to end up at the end of the day with a prediction about which drugs that virus is susceptible to, right? So at almost each of those steps, there could be variables. There can be variables in the way the sample is collected. There can be variables in the way the sample gets to the lab. There are the whole amplification and sequencing process that happens in the lab, and then the interpretation step. So that may be acceptable in some contexts, but when you're thinking about things globally and you're doing a survey, let's say in Uganda, to assess how much resistance there is in the population to a certain drug, and then a separate study is being done in Kenya or South Africa or wherever. For various reasons, it's really important to be able to compare those results to each other. So if one country is doing things one way that maybe is a little bit less sensitive than the other, at the end of the day, the result could look quite different, but not because of what's really going on in the patients, but just because of the way that the lab methods were done or the interpretation was done or that kind of thing. So that's where WHO comes in and recommends certain standard ways of doing the surveillance, choosing which patients to take blood from, how to do the testing. And so my role on that was on the laboratory side, trying to make sure that the process itself was being done in as similar way as possible. It's impossible to do it exactly the same because some countries can only access certain types of drugs or reagents or so on. And so some things are going to be inherently different, but you try to make sure that those things are the ones that have the smallest effects on the end result. And then organizing a kind of external quality assurance scheme to evaluate how those lab processes are being done and to make sure that they're getting results are sort of similar as similar as they can be to each other. So I think that's one really good example. And then on the vaccine side, that's going back a bit to it, and I was kind of really at the interface between research and development and sort of almost manufacturing sorts of things. But in order for a biological product, to be considered acceptable for use, either in clinical trials or as a final product, it needs to be produced according to standards in terms of, I'll call it cleanliness, right? So in order to make sure that your product doesn't have any contaminants in it, that it is going to do what you intend it to do and not something unintended, especially something unintended and bad, right? So there are standard procedures that are in place for organizations, companies, who are producing something that's going to be used to be administered to a person, to minimize the chances of any of that kind of thing happening. So following those standard procedures, and it's more of a guideline. The specific procedure, of course, is going to be very specific to whatever product is being made, but those sorts of standard approaches are industry-wide and really important.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear to say that standardization, specifically when collecting samples, would need to be rigidly adhered to for appropriate results. So moving on slightly to your career as a scientific consultant, we've talked a lot about data collection and the process of experiments and in taking drug samples. Could you just explain a little bit more, maybe a day in your life as a scientific consultant?
Well, day in life is variable, for one thing. So typically I have more than one client that I'm working for at any given time. And projects are moving along at a different pace. So on any given day, I might be having meetings, Zoom calls, WebEx calls with typically earlier on the scientific team behind the work that's been done that I'm going to come in and help them write up so that I can understand as much as possible the science, because for me that's crucial when I'm writing a scientific paper, as I need to understand what was done so that I can write it clearly, right? So that type of interaction happens at the beginning, and then there'll be chunks of time where I'm actually doing the writing, organizing the referencing, doing some background reading. Then I guess on occasion So a little bit more on the work that I do for WHO, but also sometimes for clients in terms of getting papers ready, doing some data analysis. So taking some information that they've collected and organizing it in a way that allows production of clear and understandable figures and tables. That's probably the bulk of the kinds of things, in different combinations from day to day, depending on where the different projects are. And then I guess another thing that comes and goes, which is just kind of inherent as an independent consultant, is planning when your next contract is coming from, right? So it's not just like this work all of a sudden magically appears. You need to be kind of working your connections, checking in with past clients, and that kind of thing. So that's kind of always ongoing a little bit in the background too.
Yeah, I guess you can never be sure when the next contract's going to come in, so you need to be searching for it.
Right.
So you just mentioned briefly about technical writing. Is there anything that you've been working on recently that you care to share that you find interesting? Or is there anything you've published in the past, maybe?
I guess I'm working on a few interesting things. One is a relatively new collection method that Roche Diagnostics has developed. So, when you're doing sample collection, let's say in a rural part of Africa where electricity might not be reliable, or access to a trained person who knows how to take a blood sample might not be available, right? So, because most of these tests that are developed rely on a blood sample of some kind, right? So typically when you go for a blood test for your annual physicals or whatever it is, you'll go to some clinic and you go into the back room and a trained person sticks a needle in your arm and collects a sample of blood, right? And then the blood has to be kept cold, or sometimes the plasma has to be separated and kept frozen. And so there are things that we don't even think about, but that are just not possible in some of these places. And so there are alternative ways to collect blood. The primary one that I'm familiar with is a dried blood spot. So you put a spot of blood onto a filter card, and then you dry that just by exposure to air. And in the process, for example, a virus in the plasma that's in that blood sample will kind of get preserved on that filter card. And then as long as you keep that filter card away from humidity and heat, you have about 2 weeks to get it to the lab. So it doesn't need to be refrigerated or frozen. You do need to handle it in a specific way, but it allows you to get around this issue of needing to freeze or keep things refrigerated. But there are certain technical issues around working with a dried blood spot sample that complicate certain downstream applications. I won't go into all the technical details, but it's not the same as a plasma sample without all the red blood cells in it, for example. So Roche came up with an alternative, basically a good compromise between separating plasma from blood and keeping it preserved on a filter card rather than in liquid form. It's a pretty ingenious device. And so there are a lot of studies going on to demonstrate its utility for different downstream applications. So I've been involved in a couple of papers that explore that. And so for me, it's a nice convergence between my interests in diagnostics in resource limited settings and my work with a client who needs to get that information written up and published. And then I guess another example has been these hepatitis viruses that I didn't know much about before, hepatitis D and hepatitis E. Not things you hear about in the news ever, right?
No.
But are biologically quite interesting. Hepatitis E is much more prevalent than I think, certainly than I ever thought about. It's not a huge health concern for most people because if you do get infected, your immune system generally takes care of it. So you might be transiently sick, but you recover. But in certain populations, like in pregnant women, for example, it's a big deal, or in immunocompromised people. So it's starting to be a target, I think, for industry who are developing drugs or vaccines or diagnostics. So yeah, that's been another new one for me.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cook your pork. That's the bottom line. In industrialized countries, the types of hepatitis E virus that cause the biggest problems are generally acquired through eating undercooked meat. So,
wow. Okay, that's something new.
Now, moving on, can you describe what lifelong learning means to you?
Yeah, it's been interesting thinking about that, because it's not something that I consciously thought I was doing or that I was trying to do over my career. But if you think about it, in just talking about it with you guys and looking back retrospectively, it's kind of been something that's been a constant, right? So coming out of an academic background where that's what it's all about, and wanting, again, without sort of consciously thinking about it that way through my career, thinking that, oh, I need to go learn something new. But it just kind of has happened and has, I think, to a certain extent, driven my career decisions and career path, right? So whether it's learning something inherently new, biologically speaking, right, which is what basic research is all about, or learning how to take something that you've developed or invented to a stage where it can actually be useful to a large number of people. That process in itself is something new that I had to learn. The difference between individualized medicine and public health, right? Not something that I sought out to learn about, but has definitely been part of my, I guess, subconscious motivation, if I put it that way. Yeah, and then as we've been talking about for these different writing projects, just knowing, getting the chance to learn more about certain things that ordinarily I wouldn't go and seek out, but has been part of what keeps me going, I guess, on those things. If it was just something else, it's interesting because there's kind of a flip side, right? Which is getting a project which is completely in my comfort zone, where I know all the details and doing it, and that's kind of easy in a way. Whereas a different topic, as I said, I can't stop myself from wanting to understand the science behind what I'm writing about. So that's where that learning piece comes in, and I think it helps me do a better job at it by doing so. It kind of happens every day, not every day, but frequently over the year as I take these things on. But again, without me consciously deciding, oh, I need to go learn something new, I'm going to go find a project about this new virus or something. That just kind of, it's, I guess I'm lucky that way, is that it's kind of part of how things have gone.
Would you also say that curiosity plays a part, in lifelong learning, in terms of, how you're curious about every new opportunity and challenge?
Absolutely. I guess they kind of go hand in hand, right? It's sort of that motivational piece, I would say, to put that you need to have in order to put the effort into learning something new. You sort of have to be a little bit curious about it, right? So yes, I think that comes up a lot, and my interest in some of the things we were talking about earlier, right, about social influences on where you get your information and the conflict between for-profit healthcare and public health. Those are all things that I'm curious about, and have had the opportunity, luckily for me, I think through my work, right, to to learn more about it. Because there are things you can also be, of course, curious about lots of things outside of your work life. And depending on where you are in your career, how much time you have to devote to that may be more limited. But hopefully, looking into the future, as I guess I scale down my work hours and increase my more personal time hours, that curiosity piece I hope will stay on and will allow me to explore some new things.
It just goes to show that the learning never stops, especially in a role such as yours. You know, you've set up your own business or consultancy service, and you're still having to refreshen your knowledge or sharpen up on certain areas to this
Definitely.
day.
Yeah. No, I think in order to sort of stay current and to maintain, in a sense, the value that I have to offer to my clients, it's important for me to stay as up to date as possible. It's impossible to be up on everything that's happening. It's the field moves so quickly, and there are new techniques and approaches that are being brought forward all the time. So I think what's important is having the aptitude and know the tools for where to go to learn those things in depth when you need to, right?
Yeah.
And segueing into mentorship, how important would you say mentorship is to you, and what role has it played in your career journey so far?
You mean the mentors that I've had? Oh, yeah, crucial. I think almost every time I've heard it, certainly scientists talk about how they got where they are, they talk about important mentors in their life, and I think I'm the same. Of course, you naturally think about the way the academic sort of progress stream goes. During your graduate studies, you typically work in someone's lab, right? So that the person who's the primary investigator of that lab is a natural mentor, and that was certainly the case for me at McGill, the lab that I did my Ph.D. in. And it was interesting because the head of the lab was actually on sabbatical the first year that I was there. And so my mentors were the senior graduate students who had been already there for several years, right? And they were kind of running the lab day to day. And so they were crucial. And I guess I would call out a specific example, which is when you're doing a scientific experiment, you set things up and you manipulate the conditions in such a way as you see what happens. Interpreting what that means is basically pointless unless you've devised the appropriate control experiment. So you have to do everything else the same, except maybe just one variable is different, and then you can, and then the difference in the result you can attribute to that variable, right? So unless you do that properly, basic research is pointless, really. And that's just kind of stayed with me ever since then. And then another example I would call it is, I guess, during my postdoctoral studies in San Francisco, as I mentioned, my supervisor had just won the Nobel Prize. His lab was quite large. His career was clearly established. And so we had this saying in the lab amongst ourselves, which was, it's your career, which basically meant that you were provided the environment and the resources to do a certain amount of work, and how you did that and how hard you worked was more or less up to you. And if you put the time and effort and energy into doing it, then you were more likely to be successful than if you didn't. And it was really kind of up to you. And that's kind of a stage of, typically that's kind of a stage of academic research and that career path where you're quite independent. You may have some support from colleagues, and I did, and I benefited from that. But your project is really your project. And that's quite different from the industry, where you are more likely to be in a team, part of a team, and one of several people working on something. But nonetheless, that lesson, I think, stayed with me, and that was maybe not a direct thing from my mentor, but but he was certainly allowed us to take our projects in the path that we wanted to take them, and provided excellent advice and resources along the way.
I think those 3 words of "it's your career" are so much, they would stick with you so much more coming from someone who has just won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, right. No, it was fortunate in many respects. So I appreciate the fact that that I was lucky there. Yeah.
So we've talked about it a little bit throughout the podcast. But what does collaboration mean to you?
Well, of course, it means several people working together towards a common goal that manifests itself in different ways, of course, in different environments. For me, in the earlier stages, collaboration can be as simple as contacting a researcher at a different university and asking for some reagents, right? They just discovered this new virus or whatever. Can you send me a sample of it so I can study it in my lab? That can be a type of collaboration, and that happens all the time. Although in some cases maybe not as easily as it should, especially if there's lawyers involved. But then in a more team-oriented environment, collaborating with other people, I think, works the best when someone can look at an end goal and come up with a plan to get there, and then divide the work that's required up into pieces that may have different requirements that can be best met by people with different aptitudes or talents, right? So being able to be part of that team, have a piece that you have some ownership of, that you drive, but in connection and in synchrony with other people doing the same thing, and to have it all come together at the end towards something much bigger. That's the gratification of working on a team, right? And so that is how I think about collaboration in that environment.
Yeah, you said it really. And at the Open Group, we're all about collaboration as well. All of our members and forums work together to create a standard. So collaboration is key, and we always see that at the Open Group as well.
Yeah, and I would imagine that also benefits from diverse experience that people bring to the table, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Following on, we'd like to touch on language. So is there any particular language, that's used in your career world that's particular to what you do?
Yeah, sure. I think that probably is the case in almost any discipline. There's a lot of terminology that you would think is generally accepted across scientific disciplines, although I've run into a few examples where that's not actually true. And then, of course, when you get down into the more specific area of research, virology or bacteriology or whatever it is, there's going to be a lot of terminology that only people working in that area are going to understand naturally. And by the way, the acronyms, the abbreviations and sorts of things that go along with some of those terminologies can get to the point where someone listening to a conversation has no idea what you're talking about, right? So we try to avoid that when we're communicating our work. But I have had a few instances of, I don't know if you've heard the saying that the problem with communication is the illusion that it's happening. So the example that comes to mind is the use of the word validation. So in the diagnostics world, having a type of test, a laboratory test that goes through validation, means that you run it so many times in certain configurations that it allows you to characterize what the test can do. How much input sample do you need to get a result? How reproducible is that result? How susceptible is it to interference from other things that might be in the sample, and so on. So that's kind of a really big piece of bringing a diagnostic product to the market. And when I started doing some work with labs in places that had not had that experience, to them, saying that their test was validated meant that they ran it 10 times or something, or that they've been doing it for years on the samples that they had access to, and they never had a problem, or they never thought they had a problem. So that was definitely something that took some back and forth after over some time, with some, less experienced in the sense of doing something for that public health application. Labs like that we needed to go through a back and forth to have a common understanding of what validation meant. So
I think language is so key, especially for collaboration. We just spoke about at the Open Group. We've got forums in cybersecurity, healthcare, a whole bunch of different things, and they all have their own unique language. So it's important that everyone understands what you're talking about and what you mean for that certain topic or area. So it's just so important. Yeah,
you end up having to devote a certain amount of time to definitions sort of at the very beginning, right? And, and
exactly.
that can be hard for people that have been talking about something in a certain way all their lives and now have to start doing it differently. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, it's been great learning about your journey so far. And now, before we wrap things up, we'd like to start with a short, quick-fire round of questions. So, to start with, what are you most looking forward to for the year ahead?
I am looking forward to more of the same, career-wise, work-wise. I'm in a good phase right now with the right number of projects that I feel is manageable, a certain amount of new things to learn, and looking forward to getting those things published. That for me that's the satisfaction at the end of the day, is seeing it get through all the steps and finally be published. So I think that I expect that to happen fair number of times this year, so looking forward to that.
Have you set aside any vacation time for the year ahead?
Yeah, I have a family wedding to go to in Canada, where I'm from originally. My family's mostly based in and around Toronto, in Ontario. So that'll be fun to see my nephew's wedding, and also going to visit my father, who's currently in Florida. So he spends some of the chunk of the winter down in Florida, play some golf with him. And then we are also planning a trip to Europe. My family heritage is in Scotland, so I can't remember the last time that I was there. So we're going to go spend some time there and maybe trace back some of the family roots there. Yeah.
Sounds like you have a great year ahead.
Do.
So I guess you've touched on it briefly, but I was going to ask what your hobbies are. But so I heard golf in there, and
yes.
Being from Canada, I know there's another one.
Yeah, well, it's ice hockey.
Yeah.
So the golf thing has become bigger than it used to be. I learned as a kid. My dad taught me and my brothers how to play, and through the pandemic, actually started playing a lot more. There was definitely a phase where it was kind of the only sort of semi-normal thing you could do because it was outside, and a way to see friends outside and that kind of thing. So as a result, my game got better, which was a nice side benefit. Then the ice hockey is important to me. I started playing again. So I played as a kid growing up in Montreal, and was never very good at it. Still, I'm not. But there's a lot of recreational hockey in the Bay Area here. So that kind of keeps me sane and hopefully physically fit. Yeah. And then my other big one is photography. So I did mention that quickly, that wildlife photography in particular. Went on a workshop in Costa Rica in 2015, and that kind of really lit that fire underneath me, and been trying to do that ever since, as often as I can.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's fun.
We'd like to say thank you for joining our show. It's been really good, as I said, learning more about you, but also about the importance, really surrounding standardization and just a overview and an exploration into it as well. It's been truly really fascinating and quite inspiring as well in terms of, what you've achieved so far, your career in general. It's great to learn from people, and it's been really great learning more about you. So thank you. Now, for those that would like to keep up to date with you, would like to get in touch, where can they reach you? For example, LinkedIn or other socials?
Yeah, I'm not a huge social media person. I do have a LinkedIn account. I use Instagram for photography sharing. My website is datafirstconsulting.com. It's probably the best place to go. So yeah, no, thanks to you guys for listening and for asking interesting questions. I hope that it's been interesting for your listeners as well.
Thank you, definitely. And to our listeners who are, keeping up to date with our podcast so far, we look forward to bringing more topics into the fold. And until next time, thank you.